So welcome, croeso. This is the second session of today's Victims Conference. It's the St. David's Day Conference, as I've been calling it for the last 5 years. And obviously we're doing this now in a virtual setting. And I'm joined by Temporary Deputy Chief Constable Emma Ackland. Croeso, Emma.
What is our Commissioner?
Fantastic. So we're gonna talk a little bit about victims and some of the work that's been being sort of undertaken within the force. There's lots of activity in relation to trying to ultimately improve the victim services that Dyfed-Powys Police give, but also you have an all Wales role that you lead on victims and witnesses for the Welsh chief officers. So we'll probably have a little discussion about that as well. But just wanted to reflect a little bit on the previous session that we did with Dyfed-Powys from Aberystwyth University, who have been doing some research and some work into domestic abuse that's affecting people over the age of 60, so older people. It was a great session, lots of information from experts in the field, really. But I know that the force has done a lot on domestic abuse over the last couple of years. So I don't know whether you wanted to maybe explain what the force has, been trying to do in terms of increasing that safeguarding of victims of domestic abuse.
Yeah, of course, Commissioner. I mean, I think for the last couple of years now, the force, as you say, has been on a journey. We're still seeking to make, some improvements, but specifically in relation to domestic abuse. There was significant findings from HMIC. There was some work, I think, that was underdone by your office in relation to domestic abuse and how the force were managing and supporting victims, and of course in investigating appropriately. But there was a gap we felt around how we were doing some front end support of officers attending incidents, and equally making sure that we were doing the right thing around the investigations and safeguarding. So we introduced two things really. One was what we referred to as a vulnerability desk in the force control room, and they're responsible really for making sure that doing all the intelligence and the background checks fast time, so that officers that are attending incidents have access to all of the information that they need to make sure that they're able to see the wider context of incidents that they're arriving at, and all the information that they need to help make some decisions to support people that are calling us. And then what we do then is make sure that all the risk assessment processes are taking place, that we fill in the complete and the right forms. And then the vulnerability hub is a multi-agency hub then that makes sure that all of the right people are engaged in the conversations that follow, to make sure that we are looking at that whole broader, wider context across public sector, doing the right thing for the victim, family, and then making sure, of course, that we're supporting the victim through GALIDI, which is the Victims and Witnesses kind of service that we have, commission service in Dyfed-Powys Police. So we really wanted to make sure that whole end-to-end journey, I suppose from start to finish, was, I suppose, more supported. We had some evidence about what we needed to do in terms of filling some gaps. And I'm confident now that we are able to see a significant improvement. For example, we've almost doubled the number of people that are reporting to us. We're criming more incidents and therefore being able to safeguard more people. So fundamentally, people might see that increase as being, potentially negative. Personally, it's a positive story, I think. One, that victims are trusting us, which is so important. So they know they can come to us, we're supportive, we do the right things, we make sure that they're managed throughout the whole process sensitively. And then equally, of course, making sure that safeguarding arrangements are in place. So huge progress. There is still some work to do, which I'm sure we'll come on to, but really pleased with what's happened up to date, yeah.
Yeah, and for me, just to reassure people in relation to that, you talked about the doubling of incidents that are recorded in the force, and I just wanted to maybe make a comment that will hopefully reassure people that is a positive thing, because more people are coming forward. It means that we, in effect, are safeguarding twice as many people that we were 2 years ago. And it's not just the individual; it's the wider sort of family and the context of where that abuse is taking place. And I think, and this is just off the top of my head, and this is from memory now, but I think about 2 years ago, it was approximately between 300 and 400 incidents being recorded by Dyfed-Powys Police every month. And it is now between 700 and 800. So it is physically that doubling of incidents. So 800 a month. I worked it out the other day. I think, on average, it's about 25 a day. So there are 25 domestic incidents that the force are dealing with on a daily basis. It just gives you the context of, the amount that the force is dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and it does put a significant demand on the force, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And I think, it's worth mentioning. I know you were going to go on to talk to Hugh Simkis around this. So it's a wider partnership approach as well, to making sure that, we as a force obviously have responsibility for responding and doing the immediate safeguarding. But, the hub and the arrangements now do mean that we can absolutely have that kind of whole rounded picture of making sure we're doing the right things for the victim and wider family. But certainly, the increase, yes, that there's demand out there. Very sadly, I think it's a plus around the positives, but equally some work for us to do with partners around, preventing and some early intervention work, which equally the hub is now working on. So rather than, potentially waiting for, somebody to report, we're offering, early signposting, early services to anybody where there's early signals that either the relationship's going wrong or they haven't yet reported to us, and they might be nervous in doing so. But how do we, manage and support those individuals as well in the right way? So, I'm really pleased with how we're managing it, but yeah, some work to do really to make sure that, we stop this from happening and make sure that people know that it's not okay. We shouldn't be treating, women or anybody in relation to this like that, and we treat it really seriously as a force.
Yeah. I agree. We do take it seriously, and it's one of the key priorities for me as the Commissioner, is to ensure that we have a service that has got, the victims at the heart of that service ultimately. And I know that the chief officers have heard me say that on a number of occasions in the meetings that we have. So you mentioned Hugh Simkis just now. He's my next guest, actually. So if people aren't aware of what I'm doing today, because this is a virtual conference, on the hour, every hour today then. So the next session will be at 12 o'clock. We've got Hugh Simkis, who works for Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service, and we're going to talk a little bit about the criminal justice system. So I'm looking forward to that. But you're right to highlight that all of this is a partnership between so many partners, because what struck me when I came and sort of sat in on the multi-agency hub activity where they have the daily management meetings, I think there was approximately 20 people involved in that conference call discussing the high and medium risk incidents of the 24 hours previously, and it was very impressive actually to think that all these agencies were coming together. Some of them specialist services, but also the police service, the unitary authority, and key stakeholders. And again, it's just framing it in that safeguarding, using that word safeguarding and framing it in that sense. That's the key, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously there's a statutory right for some agencies to be involved, and for people that may not be aware, obviously there's then a rationale for why we're able to share information. It's making sure that everybody who holds a little bit that might be, seen from their perspective as not high risk, but when you add all those bits together, you see the wider implications, and they're therefore able to step in and do what is needed. It's the real importance of sharing that information at that stage to make sure we're doing the right thing and managing the risks for the victim.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there's more to do. There's more work to do. There's always, there's always, an ambition to strive for just improving services, improving the delivery of services by the force. So what are you involved in at the moment then? What would people be interested in what the force are doing at the moment?
Well, I think, there's several things really. I mean, so internally, I suppose we knew that we had some work to do looking at how we were approaching victims, supporting victims, managing investigations, updating victims, all the things that might be referred to, I suppose, in the victims code. Now, we did find out that not a lot of people, sadly, even knew that code existed. And of course, there's a new code coming out now, which is focused in April about 12 rights of victims. So there's specific rights that obviously we need to comply with across all agencies in the criminal justice system to make sure that we are doing what we need to do to support every single person who reports a crime and goes through the process. But internally, what we've been managing to do as well is looking at our response to victims, how regularly we update them, how we signpost victims, and what information we provide. So there was a separate group set up, and Evan Charles has done some fantastic work with colleagues in the OPCC and wider with external partners to understand how we are managing that. So that's an internal force meeting But so we don't look at that in isolation. It also links into a wider criminal justice and investigations meeting. So the whole system, as I think I keep describing, really, it's not a one focus here. It really needs to be across that wider spectrum, so make sure that we get it right. So that was set up, and that internal force meeting was new in recognition that we needed to have specific focus in that right way, and they've been leading on and doing some fantastic work internally. So for example, we've just in Powys set up a new activity around victim satisfaction surveys as well. Really important to understand how we are doing to measure progress, and that's automated now. So as we crime an incident, there's an automatic message that goes out 6 weeks after the crime, so to give some ability for the victim to have regular engagement, to be able to pose, I guess, and understand how they've been treated, to complete a short survey. And we're using that then into the cycle of improvements, to making sure that we're listening to what we're being told, we're listening to where we're not getting things quite right, and continuing to change and improve that internal performance. And then you touched on my job, I suppose. Just recently, I've moved to force and then volunteered to be involved as the victims and witnesses lead. And I share that with Ed Baltrami, head of the Crown Prosecution Service. And we co-chair a meeting for the whole of Wales focused on victims and witnesses. And the primary objective for us over the next 3 years is not just to look at victim code compliance, but understand a wider performance framework across all partners, so that we look at some qualitative measures as well as just statistical measures. So sometimes it's all very well to collect data, but what I don't want to do is then think that we've got it right when there's still kind of a voice out there that's telling us we're doing other things. So it's about getting both those elements right as well in the broader way. That work is ongoing at the moment, but we're prioritising the code of compliance that comes in from April that I've mentioned already. And then what I've done as well, I chair a performance subgroup at national level now, focused purely on that performance across all policing and all criminal justice agencies. And I feed into a national victims and witnesses meeting chaired by DCC Emma Barnett. So it's quite complex. Hopefully I've kind of made that clear. Happy to answer any questions. But in essence, I've got that layering then of making sure we've got an opportunity across Wales to feed in some positive, huge progress that we've been making, international meetings, informing that wider national progress and opportunity to improve across with English forces, international meetings. And that work's ongoing. But again, in the last few months, we've seen significant progress, and we're working now with MOJ to understand, Ministry of Justice, to understand how we measure the compliance moving forward from April, and how we're continuing to improve. So not just in Dyfed-Powys, but across Wales and across into England as well.
Yeah, and I think for me, there's a key to it as well, is to just share the experiences, and if there's best practice elsewhere, that then is captured. And every force will have a different perspective, and will have a different style, I guess, of delivery. But there are some key things that you alluded to. The victims will always want some expectations sort of managed in terms of communication, in terms of outcome. And again, it's that timeliness of activity you mentioned, sort of working to try and improve investigations, and timeliness of investigations is quite a critical one. I would probably suggest as well. So yeah, it's good that these conversations are taking place. And what I liked about what you described was that there's an opportunity to try and build now the qualitative data that can feed in. So you're aware that I have a victims forum, and we're trying to develop and build that victims forum so that they can have a stronger voice, for want of a better description, into the service that they've, and the service that they've actually experienced firsthand. So it's going to we're going to get there, aren't we? I think I'm pretty confident that we're going to get there. But what you talked about is that there's lots of building blocks that are now in place, and that you're making progress on these issues.
Absolutely. I think the important point as well is, we can think we're doing well, but actually we need to be doing well for the people who need the services, not doing well from an internal perspective or a criminal justice perspective. So, ideally, and I know I've spoken to you in relation to it, we do need to then, this is what we've designed, go to that forum to say, actually, what do you think? What would that feel like for you? Have we got it right? Have we missed anything else that should be in there? So, and that opportunity, I think, to engage with people who have been part of the service we provided, and then asking them to help shape that with us, I think is just so important. I think the difficulty sometimes within policing, it can be process and task. And that's why I like the qualitative side of things, because we need to measure things like sensitivity and empathy. That those things really absolutely matter, both at the time of reporting, but then all of the way through. We're never going to be able to know what it feels like for that individual who's reporting the crime, but we can certainly manage that in a respectful, sensitive way that is only right and proper for the individual that's going through that specific crime. So those are the cultural bits that I think we need to still work on. And those are the things that we need to do so that every single officer recognises and understands that the priority for us as a force is making sure that anybody that reports crime knows that when they do that, they will absolutely be treated in the right way, they'll be supported in the right way, and we'll do our very best to make sure that we investigate in an efficient and effective manner. So those things are critical. And if we get that right and we're able to tell those stories and victims are able to sell, from our perspective, what we've done well, then we just build and generate further trust and confidence in Dyfed-Powys Police, which is absolutely brilliant. And why I think is that we're here. It's a duty and our obligation to get that bit right.
Yeah, and what was interesting in the session that we had earlier with Dyfed-Powys was that they put a big emphasis on that initial acknowledgement of the harm that's been caused. So in some cases it isn't so much about the criminal justice process. It's that initial acknowledgement and just having somebody, in effect, to listen to what has happened. And another interesting point that they came up with was that actually the disclosure can be over quite a long period of time, and that it can be quite incremental in its nature. So not to think it's a sort of task and finish, so that you deal with this, and it was in the context of domestic abuse, as I mentioned earlier, but not to think that, that first disclosure is the only contact. We need to be providing a service that can allow for multiple interactions with victims, I think is critical, isn't it? And I know this because obviously I commissioned the services in relation to domestic violence, co-commissioned across the force area, where we've got, specific specialists at play, whether it be sort of from an ISVA point of view or from a domestic violence perspective as well. So yeah, it was just really interesting hearing them talk about that initial contact and that acknowledgement, I suppose, which comes back to your point around the empathy and listening.
Absolutely. I think research has shown, evidence shows that, it must be so difficult to pick up the phone. And I don't mean that in a patronising way. We know that most of the time, most victims don't come forward almost until they're at that, that point of breaking point, really, where it's become so critical that they have to go somewhere. So, at that point in time, we need, the immediacy of the call handlers to recognise the importance of being able to, bring people gently, allow them to describe, what has gone on. And then, of course, it's really vital important that we don't force the victim to retell, but we allow one person then to build that relationship, to enable that victim to then feel supported. And then should they need to continue to, disclose, other things that have happened, we're able to kind of ensure that they've got that support in place, and we investigate in that sensitive way. So, I think the force has come, so far on the journey. And I think the bit now is for us to be, not just good at this, but very good at this, because, as I've said, I think we need to get it right.
Yeah, definitely. So we have these regular conversations about some of these topics, which is where, as the Commissioner, I'd want to see progress being made by the force. And it is pleasing to look back over I can look back now at 5 years of being in office as the Commissioner here, and the changes that have happened, subtle things that have happened over time that are having, I think, a positive difference. Now, is it true? I just wanted to double check this. Now, I've heard a rumour that the chief officers are ringing victims of crime at the moment as well. Is that a sort of a bit of a mystery shopper type, wanting to understand what the real experiences are? Is that taking place?
Yeah, it is, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because there's a balance, isn't there, with us being too involved and so involved in some of these things, and I wouldn't want people, within the force to think, well, we don't need to do something because the chief officer's doing something, or indeed, why are the chief officers doing that when we're doing that? I think genuinely, from our perspective, we're not out on the ground anymore, are we? We're not kind of in the same context as officers are. We potentially have the luxury of not, working the 24/7. We've got different tasks, different responsibilities. But actually, I think it's really important that we are in touch with that. So, for example, that the chief phoned, two victims yesterday. We're doing this kind of randomly. We're very careful about, of course, not phoning, domestic abuse victims or people that may not be able to answer, the telephone, or we might be placing them in a difficult situation. So we're careful about that. But otherwise, it's fairly random, and we're just making sure that we're, tying in an opportunity to have a conversation to understand what the system kind of feels like from their perspective. And from my perspective, as I've said, for us to be very good, we need to be a little bit picky, I think, about, where there still are gaps to feed into the work that Evan Charles and now I think Gary Phillips is taking on with others internally, just to make sure we continue to improve. So I think that's just a vitally important, role for us. And personally, I think it's a really good and healthy thing for us to be, involved in.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just wanted to double check that I got the right end of the stick, because I think it's quite an innovative sort of idea, and would be, as you say, it will be quite powerful, because it will allow you as chief officers to really get to hear some of the experiences. And we were only talking yesterday where I was asking whether you would be willing to meet with a victim with myself, somebody that's come to my office and made representation about the experiences. And in fairness, and this is true of yourself, but of your colleagues as chief officers, I've not yet had a situation where as chief officers you've declined to speak to people that have come through my office and with me, which I think is very it's pleasing for me as the commissioner, because it makes my life a lot easier. But I think it's great for the individuals as well, because they then feel that they've had an opportunity to share their experiences, good, bad, or indifferent, with chief officers, which means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the same reason, I know that the chief phoned yesterday, one was really good. One, we needed to do something else around how quickly we were managing to intervene and support the victim. So, but I think from my perspective, if we don't listen to the challenge and we're too defensive, then we're never going to improve. And I think we can only get it right more consistently if we listen to some poor experiences and some things that we haven't done quite so well, and understand why that's happened. I think it's, rather than criticize maybe for that specific incident, it's more about, so what's the root cause? Why did we do that? Is there something we need to put in place to support frontline officers? Is there something in place that we need to do around the commission services? I think it's just about understanding that, to make sure that we don't, knee jerk, but we utilize that information and we respond to the person who feels like they haven't had that, great experience, and offer that opportunity and to have the conversation and then do something about it. I think it has to be a really important part of what we do as chief officers. So there's never a problem from my perspective, and I know, as you've said, it's the same with the chief officer team in more general.
Yeah, and I think for me as the commissioner, it's about giving an opportunity for that harm to be repaired. So whatever the experiences are of the victim, that there's and again, this will be an issue. I'll probably try and weave it into my conversation with Hugh Simkis later. Is how can we ensure that the criminal justice system has that repairing of harm embedded within it? And I know restorative justice is something that can be used, and I've got a commission service that can offer that to people. But the reality is the uptake is quite small. Actually, the uptake for that service is relatively small, and perhaps it's better suited for certain crime types than others, for example. But it seems to work very well with youth offending. So I think we should be trying to promote and get restorative justice being more prominent, I suppose, within our criminal justice system. And perhaps that's one for Hugh. I'll keep that one for Hugh later on. And I just also wanted to mention that later on today at 2:00, we've got Dame Vera Baird, who's the Victims Commissioner, in conversation with me. And she just last week was sort of calling upon a victims law to be created, and for it to be not just in guidance, but for it to be in legislation ultimately. Can you see that perhaps is a powerful statement, but can you see that might be something that would come in the future?
Well, that's the bit I suppose is sometimes disappointing, isn't it? Not because we need to have that come into law, but maybe the suggestion that it needs to be law before people take it seriously. So from my perspective, that's not, not where we would want to be, where I would want to be, where policing and probably criminal justice services more generally. But I do understand, where she's coming from, and understand, the reason from her perspective, the victim's perspective, is it's only right that they must be treated in this way. So actually I can see, why she's asking for it. I can see why we've, I think, let victims down previously around compliance of the code. And in fact, as I said previously, victims are often unaware of the code, and yet one of our obligations in police is to make sure they have a victim information pack that tells them about this. So, I think it's almost like you can see how people have just got more and more fed up about the fact that things haven't changed. Personally, I genuinely believe that over the last 6 to 12 months, the way that we've approached it at Dyfed-Powys and what I see happening nationally, people really do want to show and demonstrate effectiveness and compliance. Sadly, sometimes things like process and systems and the clunkiness of how those engage and interact with each other stop us from doing what we would want to do. And I don't want that to be an excuse, because we haven't got some other things right either. But certainly I think it's not as simple sometimes to do this, but we have to get it right. So, we need to unpick some of those things that are stopping us. And there's a couple of rights that are more tricky than others, because, for example, it requires us to update, around victims' personal statements. So not only the fact that we've asked a victim whether or not they wish to make one, have they then made one? Does that then manage to find its way into the court criminal justice file? Does that then get used in court by the barrister? How do we know that that's being used in court? Now, that sounds like it might be really simple, and it should be, but because it crosses interagencies, and because it's difficult at which point and how we do that without automated systems and things like that, something that should be really straightforward, on which I think completely agree we ought to be able to demonstrate our effectiveness, actually is not that straightforward or simple. So we're working all those things through, but I do think that the new code that comes in around the rights, which comes in from April, makes people's responsibilities and agency responsibilities more prominent. It's clearer. And I think we are having those conversations, and hopefully Hugh, when he comes to speak to you shortly, will reinforce that we are now, as a wider partnership, working much more closely together to make sure that we can answer those questions for victims.
Yeah, and just that particular point, I can recall raising that in the local criminal justice board, where we felt there was a bit of an issue in relation to the victim statements and whether they were being used, and we wanted to try and monitor it. And it was impossible. If I'm perfectly honest, it was impossible for us to be able to capture that data all the way through the criminal justice system because of disparate systems. The other interesting aspect of the victim statement as well, and whether it's used or not, and whether it's read out in court is another matter. Because in talking to Her Majesty's Court and Tribunal Service about this, they were coming from a perspective of, well, if they're given to the judge, then they felt that was sufficient. Whereas actually the victim's perspective might be, well, I actually want it read out, or I want it to be more prominent. But from a HMCTS point of view, or from a systems perspective, criminal justice system, that would have been a positive outcome for them, because it had gone to the judge and it had been taken into consideration. Whereas the victim actually wants something perhaps slightly different than what the measures that we would put in place would look like, really.
That's the interesting point, and I think within the codes, I can't kind of verbatim describe it, but I think it creates the ability for a victim to do that should they wish to do so. So, I think this is where, I can see why people get, a little bit frustrated. We get somewhere, but we haven't gone the whole way. And actually, we ought to be doing this. So it's more about now, I think, that we've turned it and changed it. So it's about how we manage to make sure that happens now, as opposed to probably suggesting why it doesn't, because it's different. It feels different. We're seeking opportunities. We're more proactive. And I think everybody now is engaged in making sure the reality is we've got to get it right. So hopefully April will come and we will be in a different place. But there may be, as you've just rightly said, a critical need for us to do it, because we'll be legally obligated should that come into law, as I know some people are asking for.
Yeah. So I'm in a privileged position that I get to, speak one-to-one very often, with victims, and they come forward and they want to share their experiences, and that's done in order for me to then influence the force in relation to improving services to victims. And I can recall speaking to one victim who had been through the whole process, and I asked her whether she was willing to sort of score her experiences, sort of 0, 1, 2 being quite poor, and 10 obviously being the best. And it was interesting how it fluctuated quite significantly throughout the process. So from the initial contact perspective through to the sort of statement taking and the investigation period, all the way through the courts. Of course, that was one case and one case study, but it was really powerful in, I guess, telling me quite directly that there were areas that needed to be improved. And again, just reflecting once more on the Dewis Choice input that we had earlier when they were talking about domestic violence in particular, the post court period. So if somebody gets justice and it goes through the criminal justice system, albeit that they were saying that justice can be quite a sort of a dynamic description anyway, but there was that post court, and I guess there's something in that for police services as well, isn't there? Because there does tend to be a bit of a start and finish to the involvement of the police, because it's then given to the CPS and it goes through the criminal justice system. Of course, the police are involved thereafter, but the services for victims need to be perhaps available for a much longer period of time to give that consistency.
Yes, and I think, and all of us as agencies need to absolutely understand how we make that feel seamless for a victim. And that's where I think we need to do the more the qualitative, the softer side of things to come together to understand what that might feel like. Because otherwise, what we don't want to do is feel like you've done your bit and withdraw. And then but because actually within the whole process, there's a lot of coming and going, if that makes sense, because there's things that we do as policing, both at the beginning, during the investigation, after court, and then even as simple, potentially as giving some property back. So we're engaged in all of those elements at a different point in time. And then partner agencies will be doing the same things, as well as kind of third sector and supportive, partners too. So, it is complex. And of course, every single person may want different things. But we need to be able to have a flexible approach and be able to respond to understand what people need. That's how we should manage that initial conversation, so that we understand what that individual wants and needs from us, and then that conversation can continue to provide the support. Otherwise, I can see how it might feel like an ebb and flow, and it's difficult sometimes, isn't it? And it's hard to get it right all of the time. But there's certainly things that we should and could be doing, in my view, to improve, and that's what we're focused on doing, with partners in Dyfed-Powys. And then
yeah, indeed. I can see that there's been some comments in relation to restorative justice, and I can see that William Powell, who's a member of the Police and Crime Panel, and ordinarily, this is why it's so strange in these times, that ordinarily we'd be holding this at police headquarters. We have a room full of about 150 odd people to listen to guest speakers. But what I'm hoping from this session is that post-event, people will be able to digest some of these inputs, and we might get a few thousand people viewing them, because we have had, thousands of people watching the Commissioner in Conversation session. So it is a bit different, the main reason for setting up it's sort of badged as the St. David's Day conference, because obviously we're the force that polices St. David's, and why wouldn't we have a St. David's Day conference? And we've had 5 years, and I can remember coercive control was the first topic that we did. We've done a focus on mental health, we've done a focus on cyber crime, and last year we did a focus on rural crime, rural issues. So a great opportunity for people to come together, listen to speakers, and just have I was trying to get the force as well to try and get some of the officers and staff police staff to sit in so that they could hear about the fantastic work that's being done in other agencies, with research and academic institutions such as Aberystwyth University and the input we've had with Dewis Choice. So hopefully we'll be in a position that this can be also digested by officers and staff, and not just in the Dyfed-Powys area. It'd be good to think that people are watching and listening and engaging with this further afield as well. So that's the ambition anyway. So I just wanted to make another sort of quite serious point, I guess. If somebody feels at the moment vulnerable and that they're in harm's way, they should be ringing and contacting and getting sort of reaching out for some support. If there's an immediate threat, you need to ring 999 or to ring 101 to get the services. There are also independent services available, so you can speak to specialist domestic violence professionals. If you go onto the Live Fear Free helpline, there's a number. So we'll try and make sure that as we're having these sessions today, that we remind people, even on the chat on the Facebook page, that what the numbers are and some of the websites for people to seek out support, because what the police is all about ultimately is safeguarding the communities of the Dyfed-Powys Police Force area. So hopefully you agree with sort of how I described the ringing 101 and getting in contact if there's sort of an immediate threat.
Yes, of course. And I think the bit that's really important is, if you need urgent help now, please don't hesitate to ring the 999. And if you do want help but it's not urgent, but you suddenly think, or you find the space to be able to call about anything, whether that's domestic abuse, sexual assault, or any crime at all, but sometimes people don't even want to speak to an operator. So equally, of course, now we've got the Single Online Home. There's a digital page. So if you wanted to go in and just log some details yourself and go on and send that, and then it's done, but you don't have to actually physically speak to somebody, but at least you manage to find the confidence to report it online, and then we will be able to come back to you and obviously have the conversations with you at the point that's going to be appropriate for whoever has reported the crime. So it's just that extra avenue now that I think offers not just the support for people that would prefer to do it from a tech point of view, but equally we know that some victims would prefer to do it that way as well. So again, it just offers that additional layer of enabling people to report crime to us.
Yeah, and the force has invested quite a bit in that digital activity, which I think is it's pleasing to see, but we need to also ensure that there's some of the more traditional ways of contacting the police are available as well. But how has that, have you seen quite a significant increase in people using those opportunities to contact digitally?
Yes, certainly. And I think, because of the way we used it during, COVID and tested that out, I suppose, because it was suddenly just a different offer, because so many people were at home and working more virtually using technology anyway. I think we saw a lot of people start reporting. Whether or not that's different people or additional people to the traditional demand and use of the telephones, for example, we're not quite sure yet. We're doing some work to understand what that looks like for us, to make sure we have the right number of call handlers, the right people dispatching to the calls, etc. So I think it's just making sure that we get that absolutely right. But we've also got the digital desk in there now as well. So we're utilising people to be more proactive, to have a little look and see what's happening on social media, to be able to respond to Twitter and to Facebook in a more proactive way. Again, just that offer of assistance and help to make sure that we can tie all of it together to get the right response for people that are either asking for our help or asking questions more generally. So it's just that the wider offer. But I think in terms of how the take-up of that technology around single online home influences future demand, it's early days yet, but I certainly think I can see it started to grow and develop. But the bit that you make around traditional calls and traditional availability, that's the flexibility we need. And certainly, you know as well as I do, the generations that live, the demographics that are within Dyfed-Powys, some of those people are, of the older generation. And so it is not suddenly that we intend to shift totally into digital in recognition that's not going to suit some people. We have to have the telephone offer available. So it's just the flexible approach. We needed to widen the offer, and that's what we're seeking to do, really. So please feel free to anybody that's out there to use any of those mechanisms. You're very welcome to do so.
Yeah, brilliant. Emma, I know you're a busy individual. The temporary Deputy Chief Constable for the force. So I'm really grateful. I'm very pleased that you've joined me as part of the conference today and allowed us to have a conversation about what the force is doing and what you're doing in that All Wales role as well, to try and, ultimately at a strategic level influence the operational activity to make sure that the victims have the best possible service that they can expect from Dyfed-Powys Police. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it very, very much. I'll be keeping an eye on how the progress goes in relation to some of these developments, because especially the digital activity, there's an element of an unknown to that additional demand that could come through some of the digital activity. But as you will expect, you've come to expect now with me, I'll be keeping a close eye on some of that activity, and I look forward to our meetings over the next few months to see how progress is being made. But just finally, thank you very much. Diolch Emma.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And it's never a problem. I really enjoy these, and it's never so much of a priority, to be honest. So in all seriousness, from my perspective, really keen that we get this right. So thanks for the opportunity to have the conversation. I hope people do watch this, and if there's any views or comments or anything you need to bring back to me so that I can respond, more than happy for that to happen as well. Thank you.
Thank you.